Recently, I was listening to a series of lectures on New Testament writings. The head speaker claimed that he would be providing his audience a historical analysis on the writings without any theological influence or perspectives. Strictly historical. So I was naturally intrigued. I was interested. Well, by the third lecture of what I believe was 12 lectures, I stopped listening after the third lecture. The reason is because by only the third lecture, the speaker wanted to discuss Paul the Apostle's core beliefs and theological foundations. And what his analysis came up with is that Paul believed in justification by faith alone, and this professor was going to use Romans chapter 3 to prove his point. Now, this game is all too common. Hiding your sermons and your theological agendas in a box that has a bow-written historical analysis and hope that idiots out there won't detect your hidden motives. One of the things that made me laugh about this, quote, historical analysis, end quote, was that by the third lecture, they're already going into Paul's letter to the Romans, which, as many of you know, that was Paul's last letter. It is the sixth book of the Bible, but it was Paul's last letter. So typically, if you're going to do a historical analysis, you go chronologically. But no, this professor was not bashful, and he was, by the third one, he had to get his agenda in there and tell you that the justification by faith alone was a core foundational belief of Paul's, which is wrong. But I get it. I understand why Protestants try to fit some type of sola fide or sola scriptura doctrine in the first millennium instead of the second millennium with Martin Luther. How many times have you seen Protestant videos on YouTube claiming that St. Augustine, the bishop of Carthage, was somehow a Protestant, a closet Protestant 1,000 years before Martin Luther developed the doctrines of sola fide and sola scriptura? So I get it. I understand why they want to try and put Protestantism. I've said 1,000 times, history is not the friend of Protestants. It's a huge thorn in their side. And so many of them are trying to pull that thorn out. So then, where does justification by faith alone come up? Where did Martin Luther come up with this idea? It comes from Paul's letter to the Romans, more specifically chapter 3, verse 28, which reads, "And we see that we are justified by our faith apart from works of the law." So Martin Luther, I'm not going to argue that is what it says. Martin Luther is spot on with this passage. However, my first argument would be that I don't believe Martin Luther fully comprehends what Paul is talking about in the letter to the Romans. I don't believe the professor fully comprehends what Paul is talking about. I believe 95% of the people out there who claim to understand Paul's letter to the Romans are all full of crap on both sides, Catholic and Protestant. Paul's letter to the Romans is a confusing casserole of jargon. It's back and forth, and it's full of contradictions. I side with Peter, who said that Paul's letters are sometimes confusing and hard to understand. Yeah, he's spot on with that. Hit the nail right on the head. And I think there's a lot of people out there that want to claim they understand it, but they really don't. Let's go to an earlier chapter of Romans, chapter 2. Read Romans 2:6 and 2:7, where it says, God will give to those in accordance for what they have done. And eternal life awaits for those who have done good. These are direct contradictions with we are justified by faith alone. Why didn't the professor choose chapter 2, 6, and 7 as Paul's core belief system? Why did Martin Luther ignore chapter 2 altogether when he developed the tenet of faith alone? Well, for those of you who watched my series on the Untold Protestant Reformation, you know the answer to that question. Anyway, moving on. Argument number 2. The letter of James is said to have been written before Paul's letter to the Romans, which they believe is right around 58, 59 AD. And the letter of James is also in clear contradiction with Romans 3:28. James 2:24 says, as we know, we are justified not by faith alone. Many of you know that, but that's a direct contradiction to Paul's verse, or the verse of 3:28 in Romans. Third argument, Paul's writing to the Church of Rome, the church that's still standing today and has been for 2,000 years. If Paul believes that justification by faith alone should be a core tenet, how come the Roman church of 2,000 years did not conform to his belief? Did Paul fail, or did the professor misunderstand Paul? Did Jesus fail by choosing Paul if justification by faith alone was one of his core beliefs? Because it doesn't come out for 1,500 years. That's an epic fail on Jesus. Next argument. To believe that Paul believed in justification by faith alone as a core tenet is just historically inaccurate, and it's denying credibility to the true founder, Martin Luther. It's trying to say, well, Martin Luther only discovered that. No, if Martin Luther was alive, he would fight you tooth and nail to say that he came up with justification by faith alone. It's just a denial of historical fact. And the last argument has to do with history as well, having to do with Paul's letter to the Romans. Like, as I said, it's written around 58 to 59 AD, and he's going to die about 4 years after that. The first gospel of Mark, isn't written till about 70 to 71 AD. Then you get the Gospel of Matthew and Luke in the mid-80s AD, and then the Gospel of John mid-90s. That's according to most historians and most biblical scholars. That we can save timing for another day or another argument, but that's what most historians argue. So if the letter of Paul is written 12 years before the first gospel, it seems that none of the gospel writers got the memo about justification by faith alone, because it's not found in any gospel. It's not found in Luke's gospel or Acts of the Apostles. No one says anything about it in Jesus's quotes, or in fact, when we get to the Gospel of Matthew, the parable about separation, when Jesus separates the sheep and the goats, he separates them in accordance for what they have done. That would be a direct contradiction, again, of Paul's supposed core belief, that Matthew certainly doesn't seem to have gotten the memo on this core belief. Or could it be that the professor has completely misunderstood Paul along with Martin Luther? Which one sounds more likely? Or how about this? Let's make two groups and separate them on two different sides of the room. On one side, we're going to call this group on this side the Sola Fide dudes. And in that group, you have Martin Luther and the professor. They're the guys who believe in justification by faith alone. And on the other side of the room, these guys are the against sola fide, or the contradictory views against the sola fide dudes. So who's on this side of the room? Well, I already showed you. James says that 2:24 says you're justified not by faith alone. So he's against the sola fide dudes. And James, well, he's an apostle. Are these sola fide guys? You guys aren't apostles? No. Okay. Now next, we got Paul. Paul's chapter 2. Although these sola fide dudes twisted his chapter 3, and they took it for their own means. Paul's chapter 2 is in direct contradiction. So we're going to put Paul on the contradictory side. And Paul, he's an apostle too. You guys are not apostles on this side, right? Okay, no. So we got 2 apostles. And then now the 3, then we have Matthew. Matthew's gospel, where they separate the sheep and the goats. That's a contradiction of justification by faith alone. So now we got 3 apostles, and who said that quote of separating the sheep and the goat? That was Jesus. So we got 3 apostles in Jesus against Professor and Marty. You pick which ones you want to be, which side you want to be on, and which side you think is right. I know which side I'm going to be on.